Hi again. In Dwight Wilson, Armageddon Now, the Premillenarian response to Russia and Israel since 1917. In the last segment, Wilson has been dealing with the question that was debated back then in the 19-teens and 20s. Is there going to be a restoration of the Jews before Christ returns, or is it all to be after? Therefore, is the Zionist movement fulfilling Bible prophecies? And that argument goes on here. A later article by Thomas Chalmers concerning the Palestinian Mandate observed that there might be a great inrush of Jews and a vast development of Palestine, but that until the Lord comes, the hand of the Gentile must be on Palestine. He felt it was necessary for the Gentiles to remain in power to prevent the Arabs from exterminating the Jews, and that the necessary prerequisite for the Jewish return was their conversion to Christianity. Quoting from Chalmers here, Israel will not jump at once to full control of Palestine. That will never come again while the Jews remain in rebellion against their true sovereign, the Lord Jesus Christ. End of quote. Still another author, somewhat later, reflected a slight modification of this theme, stating that the Zion movement is one of the greatest forces and one of the most futile institutions ever established by a deluded people. If the money of the universe were put into the hands of the Jews and all the transportation facilities of the world were theirs, they could not be gathered in that land at the present moment. End of quote. The preliminary event called for by this writer, though, was not the regeneration of the Jews, but the return of Christ, the King of the Jews. They were to be restored to the land by Christ, and this was to occur prior to any wholesale conversion on their part. The above views did not reflect any particular editorial philosophy of the King's Business magazine, but represented the common confusion and conflict in interpreting supposedly clear, but evidently obscure, scriptural passages. At the same time, the magazine also carried the opposite view. It was expressed by J.A. Voss, that is V-A-U-S, who was superintendent of the Jewish department of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which is now Biola. He admitted that, quote, some Bible students entertain the conviction that the present Zionist movement for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine is doomed to failure because, as they claim, it is a man-made movement which leaves God out of all considerations. End of quote. But Voss saw the current progress in Palestine as the, quote, beginnings of that great return, unquote. The fact that Israel is going back in unbelief, he said, and that Palestine is destined to become a center of Jewish culture, that the temple will be rebuilt with a consequent revival of Judaism, is not proof that the present return is not the one predicted in the prophetic books. For we are, by the prophets, led to expect that the national conversion of Israel would follow and not precede the return to Palestine. End of quote. The Pentecost Evangel magazine buttressed its view of restoration prior to the Second Coming by reporting contemporary Jewish prophetic interpretations which parallel that view. A Zionist leader by the name of Dr. Sokolov, maybe pronounced Sokolov, at least the spelling here as L-O-W at the end, was cited as saying that the ancient prophets had forecast centuries before that the Messiah would come after the Jews had returned to their homeland, and that this restoration presumably had already been accomplished since Jews of every nation were represented by the immigrants. Also quoted was similar material published by the London Christian Herald. And here's a direct quote again. The secretary of one of the synagogues says, "The Jews have been waiting 2,000 years for Britain's help, but the British will not always remain here. A certain rabbi making a prophecy 700 years ago foretold that the British would come into Palestine in 1916, but that they would leave before the expiration of a quarter of a century. This has yet to be fulfilled. Then, the rabbi said, there will be a big war here. The last world war will occur in Palestine. The kings of the earth shall fight against the Jews in Palestine, but the Messiah will come and cause the enemy to be defeated. The Messiah will be recognized as the great world leader. The law of the Lord shall flow out of Zion, and nations will learn war no more." End of quote. Wilson concludes this section, "In face of continued Zionist success in subsequent years, this restoration now view prevailed, although in this era the dissenting view was considered as a viable interpretation by some premillenarians after the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1948, it virtually disappeared." We have done several videos on Zechariah 14, which seems to be one of the bases of this rabbi's quote, that there will be a war, and it'll be the final war, because the Messiah himself will interrupt it by coming visibly and his feet standing on Mount Zion. Now that passage, Zechariah 14, was the earthquake that shook 2 Jehovah's Witnesses out of the watchtower. So we tell that story in this series of videos. They're all linked. I think there's about 5 of them. Anyway, the first one's on your screen. Zechariah 14, the quake that shook 2 Jehovah's Witnesses out of the watchtower. See you soon.